It was October 15th, 2019, and the night had settled in thickly over the remote campsite nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves as a cool breeze swept through the trees. Emily, the new night shift camp counselor, was alone by the flickering campfire, her eyes darting nervously at every little noise. The darkness seemed to close in around her, making her feel as if she was being watched, though she couldn't see anyone nearby. Emily tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, reminding herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks. But the sensation of being observed grew stronger, an invisible gaze that bore into her from the depths of the forest. She rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the chill that had nothing to do with the night's temperature. Her heart began to race as she heard faint whispers carried by the wind, as if the forest itself was trying to speak to her. The whispers became more distinct, though the words were still indecipherable, sending shivers down her spine. Emily stood up, clutching the flashlight in her hand, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The fire crackled behind her, but it offered little comfort. The noises around her grew louder, more intense, as if something was drawing closer. Emily's breath quickened as she scanned the perimeter, searching for the source of the disturbance. Just as she was about to retreat to the safety of the counselor's cabin, a loud crash echoed from the nearby trees, causing her to jump. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow dart between the trees. Panic surged through her, and she took a hesitant step backward, wondering if she should investigate or run. The air was thick with tension, every fiber of her being screaming that she was no longer alone. Emily's curiosity got the better of her as she slowly stepped forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees like towering sentinels watching her every move. Each step she took was met with an uneasy silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The shadow she had glimpsed moments ago seemed to have vanished, but the sense of being watched remained, more palpable than ever. She cautiously made her way toward the source of the crash, her heart pounding in her chest. The underbrush crunched beneath her feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a small clearing. There, nestled between the trees, stood an old, abandoned cabin that she had never noticed before. The structure was dilapidated, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, as if it had been forgotten by time. Emily hesitated at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. Something about the cabin felt wrong, like it was a place she shouldn't be. But the whispers in the wind seemed to urge her forward, coaxing her to step inside. With a shaky breath, she pushed the creaking door open and stepped into the darkness. Her flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, revealing a room filled with dust and cobwebs, as if no one had set foot inside for years. As she explored the small space, her light fell upon a dusty journal lying on a rickety table. Emily picked it up carefully, brushing off the thick layer of dust. The journal's cover was cracked and worn, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it to the first page and began to read. The entries were cryptic, filled with disjointed thoughts and references to a watcher who protected the camp. The more she read, the more she realized that the cabin, and whatever haunted it, held secrets far older than she could have imagined. Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the journal, each word pulling her deeper into the mystery of the camp's forgotten past. The entries spoke of a guardian spirit, a presence that had watched over the campsite for decades. The words were frantic, as if the writer had been desperate to warn whoever found the journal. Emily's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, reading about strange occurrences similar to what she had experienced. Whispers in the wind, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and a feeling of being watched. As she read further, the tone of the entry shifted. The writer began to describe the Watcher not as a malevolent force, but as a protector. The spirit, it seemed, was once a camp counselor who had died tragically while saving a group of campers from a forest fire. Unable to move on, the counselor's spirit had remained, bound to the campsite, determined to keep the children safe from any harm. Emily's fear began to wane, replaced by a deep sense of empathy for the lost soul who only wanted to do good. Emily decided that she needed to help the spirit find peace. She returned to the campfire, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. The forest no longer felt threatening, and the whispers that had once terrified her now seemed like a plea for understanding. She knew what she had to do. Emily began gathering supplies from the campsite, a few candles, some dried herbs, and a small bell, all items mentioned in the journal for a ritual that would honor the spirit and acknowledge its presence. As she prepared the ritual, the atmosphere around the camp seemed to change. The wind, once cold and harsh, now felt gentle, almost comforting. The forest, which had felt so ominous, was now serene under the moonlight. Emily felt the presence of the Watcher nearby, no longer a source of fear, but a silent companion. With everything in place, she lit the candles and began the ritual, speaking softly to the spirit, offering her gratitude and asking for its protection over the campers. As Emily completed the ritual, a wave of calmness washed over her. The flickering candle flames steadied, and the wind that had once carried eerie whispers now seemed to hum softly, as if in response to her words. She stood still for a moment, her eyes closed, allowing the tranquility of the moment to seep into her. For the first time since taking on the night shift, she felt truly at peace within the forest, as though she was no longer alone in her duties. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The once oppressive darkness around the camp now felt lighter, almost welcoming. Emily could sense the presence of the Watcher, but it was no longer lurking in the shadows. Instead, it felt warm and protective, like a guardian watching over the camp. She opened her eyes and looked around, the forest now illuminated by a soft, ethereal glow, as if the spirit was showing its gratitude. Emily whispered a quiet thank you, feeling a connection with the spirit that transcended words. She carefully placed the journal back in the old cabin, leaving it as a testament to the spirit's dedication and as a guide for anyone who might come after her. As she stepped out of the cabin and back into the clearing, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the spirit had found peace through her actions. When she returned to the campfire, the flames burned brightly, casting a comforting light over the campsite. The strange noises that had haunted her earlier were gone, replaced by the soothing sounds of the night. Emily sat down by the fire, a serene smile on her face, knowing that the Watcher would continue to protect the campers, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. The night was calm, and for the first time, Emily felt like she truly belonged in this place, surrounded by the quiet strength of the forest and the silent guardian who watched over it all. On the night of July 22nd, 2022, A thick fog rolled into the dense forest campsite in the Pacific Northwest, enveloping the area in an almost supernatural shroud. Jack, a seasoned camp counselor with years of experience, was on his night shift, but something felt different this time. The air was heavy with humidity, and the usual sounds of the night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, were strangely muted, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As Jack made his rounds, a growing unease settled in his chest, making him constantly look over his shoulder. It wasn't long before he heard the first sign that he wasn't alone. Soft footsteps echoed behind him, just faint enough to make him question if he had imagined them. He stopped, turning around slowly, his flashlight slicing through the fog in a wide arc. The beam revealed nothing but the swirling mist and the silhouettes of the towering trees. But the footsteps persisted, coming closer and then stopping as soon as Jack moved. His heart began to race as the realization sank in. Whatever was out there was following him, and it was keeping its distance. Jack continued his patrol, but the sense of being watched grew stronger with each step. The fog was so thick that it obscured even the nearest tents, making the campsite feel more like a maze than the familiar grounds he knew so well. Every now and then, he caught a fleeting glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, but whenever he turned to look, there was nothing but the fog. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides, broken only by the occasional crunch of his boots on the gravel path. As the night wore on, Jack's nerves were frayed. He could feel the presence growing closer, but he still couldn't see it. The footsteps, once soft and distant, were now unmistakably near, and the fog seemed to thicken, as if trying to smother him. His flashlight flickered, casting ominous shadows that danced on the edge of his vision. With every step, he could sense the unseen visitor drawing nearer, the space between them shrinking, and with it, his courage. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he decided to confront whatever was following him. He turned sharply, shining his flashlight into the fog, determined to catch a glimpse of his unseen pursuer. But the beam revealed nothing but swirling mist and the gnarled branches of the trees. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving Jack in an eerie silence that only heightened his anxiety. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at his sanity. Determined to find the source of the disturbance, Jack began to search the area more thoroughly. As he moved deeper into the fog, he stumbled upon something buried halfway in the ground, a small old chest covered in dirt and moss. The chest was locked, but the padlock was rusted and looked like it could be easily broken. Jack knelt down, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands. His curiosity was piqued, but a deep-seated fear warned him to leave it untouched. Still, something compelled him to open it, as if the chest itself was calling to him. With swift motion, Jack broke the brittle padlock and lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of old personal items, a silver locket, a pocket watch, and a worn photograph of a young woman with a soft smile. There was also a letter, yellowed with age, its ink faded, but still legible. Jack felt an inexplicable connection to these items, as if they held a story that was deeply intertwined with the campsite's history. The letter, however, was unfinished, and the woman's name was mysteriously erased, leaving only a blank space where it should have been. As he held the photograph, a sudden chill ran down Jack's spine. The fog around him seemed to thicken, and the air grew colder, almost suffocating. He felt the presence of the unseen visitor closing in, more tangible now, as if it was watching him with increasing intensity. The footsteps resumed, louder and more insistent, but still, there was no one to be seen. Jack's grip tightened on the photograph, his mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? What happened to her? And why did he feel such a strong connection to these forgotten relics? Jack's unease grew as he examined the photograph, the woman's erased name adding to the mystery that now consumed him. The footsteps that had haunted him throughout the night were no longer distant. They were right behind him, relentless, as if the unseen visitor was growing impatient. Jack's hand trembled as he placed the photograph and let her back in the chest. But the moment he tried to close the lid, the temperature around him dropped even further, and the footsteps stopped once more, leaving an unnerving silence in their wake. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack decided to take the chest back to the camp office, where he could examine it more closely in the safety of the indoors. But as he lifted the chest, a sudden weight seemed to press down on him, almost as if the air itself had grown heavy. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Jack's breath came in short, panicked bursts, each exhale visible in the freezing air. The once faint whispers of the forest returned, louder now, carrying words that he still couldn't quite make out, but which filled him with dread. As Jack trudged through the fog, carrying the chest, he noticed that the footsteps had resumed, matching his own pace. But this time, they were accompanied by something else. A low, barely perceptible humming sound. It was a mournful tune, and it sent shivers down Jack's spine. He tried to move faster, his boots crunching against the gravel, but the presence followed him, closer than ever. Every instinct told him to abandon the chest, to leave it behind and run. But his curiosity and the connection he felt to the items inside kept him going. Finally, he reached the camp office, the small building barely visible through the thick fog. As he crossed the threshold, the humming stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly, though the sense of being watched remained. Jack placed the chest on the desk and carefully laid out its contents. The photograph, the locket, the pocket watch, and the unfinished letter. Each item seemed ordinary, yet they carried an inexplicable sense of sorrow and loss. Jack stared at them, his mind racing with possibilities. Who had these belonged to? Why were they buried here? And what did the unseen visitor want from him? Jack sat in the dim light of the camp office, his eyes fixed on the mysterious items laid out before him. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves outside. Despite being indoors, he still felt the presence lingering, as if it had followed him into the building. The air was thick with tension, and the photograph of the unnamed woman seemed to hold his gaze, her erased identity, a puzzle he couldn't shake. Jack reached for the unfinished letter, hoping it might offer some answers. As he unfolded the fragile paper, his hands shook slightly, the words written in a cursive script. The letter spoke of a deep love, a promise made under the stars, and a plan to meet at the very campsite where Jack now sat. But the letter abruptly ended, the final sentence trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. The name of the woman was missing, replaced by a blank space that seemed to taunt him with its absence. As Jack read the letter, the room grew colder, and the unseen visitor made its presence known once more. The footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, echoing just outside the office door. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the temperature drop even further, his breath coming out in visible puffs. The humming sound from before began again, this time louder and more distinct, a haunting melody that filled the small room. Jack felt a deep sense of sorrow wash over him, a sadness that wasn't his own, but that of the spirit that seemed to be reaching out to him. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and for a moment Jack feared whatever was out there would come inside. But the door remained closed, and the humming slowly faded away, leaving only the silence and the unanswered questions. Jack carefully placed the letter back in the chest, his mind swirling with thoughts. The presence outside the door remained, as if watching and waiting. Jack knew he had uncovered only a fraction of the mystery, but the rest eluded him, hidden in the fog and shadows that surrounded the campsite. Jack decided to leave the chest where he had found it, back in the ground, hidden away from curious eyes. He carried it back through the fog, the footsteps accompanying him the entire way. As he buried the chest once more, the fog began to lift, and the presence slowly faded, leaving Jack alone in the clearing. The mystery of the unseen visitor remained unsolved, the chest and its contents a reminder of a story left unfinished. Jack walked away with more questions than answers, the eerie night forever etched in his memory. On the night of September 9th, 2023, Sarah, a new camp counselor, was assigned the night shift by the lake at a secluded campsite in the Midwest. The moon cast a silver glow over the water, and the trees rustled softly in the cool breeze. As Sarah made her rounds, she noticed a flickering light in the distance, near the edge of the lake. Curious, she walked closer and discovered an old campfire burning steadily, its flames dancing in the night air. But what struck her as odd was that no one was around, and the fire looked as though it had been burning for hours, if not longer. The fire gave off an eerie light, its flames unnaturally vibrant against the darkness. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of sadness as she approached, a heavy weight settling in her chest. She couldn't explain why, but the closer she got to the fire, the stronger the feeling grew, as if the flames were trying to communicate something to her. She knelt beside the fire, watching the embers crackle and pop, but there was no warmth coming from the flames, only a cold, hollow sensation that sent shivers down her spine. As Sarah stood by the fire, she began to hear faint, distant laughter carried on the wind. It was the sound of children, joyful and carefree, but it seemed out of place in the stillness of the night. She turned, looking around for the source of the laughter, but the campsite was empty, the tents dark and silent. The laughter faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Sarah alone with the strange, unyielding fire. She tried to douse the flames with a bucket of water she found nearby, but no matter how much water she poured on the fire, it continued to burn, undeterred. The persistent fire and the phantom laughter began to weigh on Sarah's mind. She felt a deep, inexplicable connection to this spot, as if she had been here before, though she knew that was impossible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden realization that the fire's flames were not random. They flickered in a pattern, almost like they were forming shapes, trying to tell a story. But what story? And why did she feel such a profound sense of loss as she watched the flames dance in the night? Sarah couldn't shake the strange connection she felt with the fire as she stood there, watching the flames flicker and twist in the night air. The cold, empty sensation grew stronger, pressing down on her as if the fire was pulling her into its depths. That night, she dreamed vividly, dreams of a time long past, where the campsite was alive with the sounds of laughter, voices, and crackling fires. She saw faces in her dreams, faces of children and counselors gathered around this very campfire, their expressions frozen in joy. In the dream, the scene shifted abruptly. The joyful campfire gathering turned dark as storm clouds rolled in, and a sense of dread washed over the campers. Sarah watched, powerless, as the flames began to die down, and the once happy faces were replaced with fear. The fire, now struggling to stay lit, became a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Then, without warning, the campers vanished, leaving only the fire burning alone in the deepening night. Sarah awoke with a start, her heart racing, the vivid images still fresh in her mind. Determined to understand the meaning behind the dream, Sarah spent the following days searching the camp's old records and talking to the senior counselors. She found an old photograph in the lodge, a black and white picture of a group of campers from years ago, sitting around a campfire. The faces were familiar. They were the same ones she had seen in her dream. But the photograph was dated decades before Sarah had ever set foot in the camp. She felt a chill as she realized the fire in the photo was in the exact spot where the strange campfire now burned. That night, Sarah returned to the lakeside with the photograph in hand. The fire was still burning, just as it had the previous night, and the same cold, sorrowful feeling settled over her as she approached. She held the photograph up to the firelight, the flames casting a warm glow on the old picture. As she did, the laughter returned, faint and distant, just like before. The flames flickered more intensely, almost as if they recognized the faces in the photograph. Sarah's heart ached with a sadness she couldn't explain, as if she was mourning the loss of something precious, something tied to this fire and those long-gone campers. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at the photograph in the flickering firelight, the faces of the long-gone campers seeming to watch her through time. The connection between the photograph and the strange campfire was undeniable, but the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. How could a fire burn for decades without anyone noticing? And why did it seem to call out to her specifically? These questions haunted her as she stood by the fire, feeling the weight of its untold story pressing down on her. The next morning, Sarah went to the camp's old archives, determined to uncover more about the campers in the photograph. After hours of searching through dusty files and faded records, she found a journal belonging to one of the camp's former directors. The entries detailed a tragic event that had occurred many years ago. A sudden and violent storm had swept through the area, and several campers had gone missing during the chaos. Despite extensive searches, their bodies were never found. The journal mentioned that the fire by the lake was left burning as a memorial to the lost souls, a beacon to guide them home if they ever returned. As Sarah read those words, the sense of sorrow that had plagued her since discovering the fire deepened. She realized that the campfire was more than just a symbol of loss. It was a link between the living and the dead, a connection to those who had been lost in the storm. The dreams she had, the strange feelings she experienced, all pointed to one thing. The fire was a portal of sorts, a way for the lost campers to reach out from the other side. But what did they want? Why were they reaching out to her? That night, Sarah returned to the lakeside, the journal in hand, and sat by the fire. The flames seemed to dance more vigorously, as if responding to her presence. She opened the journal to the last entry and read aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. As she did, the flames began to twist and shape themselves into ghostly forms, figures of children and counselors from years past. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the spectral images dance around the fire, their expressions a mix of joy and sorrow. The connection she felt was undeniable, and she knew that the campers had a message for her, one that she needed to uncover before the night was over. As Sarah watched the ghostly figures dance around the fire, she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. The flames seemed to pulse with life, their movements synchronized with the spectral forms that appeared within them. The laughter she had heard before now mingled with soft whispers, the voices of the lost campers reaching out to her from beyond. They were trying to communicate something, a message buried in the flames that Sarah was determined to decipher. She leaned closer to the fire, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the whispers. The journal in her hand seemed to vibrate with energy, the words on its pages blurring and shifting as if they were alive. Sarah realized that the key to understanding the camper's message lay within the journal, within the final entry she had read earlier. She flipped back to the last page, her eyes scanning the text desperately, searching for any clue that might unlock the mystery. As she read the final words aloud once more, the flames flared up, and the ghostly figures became clearer. The campers were smiling, their faces full of warmth and gratitude, but there was also a deep sadness in their eyes. Sarah felt tears welling up as she understood. They weren't just reaching out to her, they were saying goodbye. The fire had served its purpose, acting as a beacon to guide their souls, but now it was time for them to move on. The storm that had claimed their lives had finally passed, and they could now find peace. With a heavy heart, Sarah whispered a farewell to the spirits, her voice trembling with emotion. The flames began to die down, the spectral figures fading slowly, their forms dissolving into the night. The sadness that had weighed on her for so long started to lift, replaced by a profound sense of closure. The fire, which had burned for decades, finally flickered out, leaving only the glowing embers behind. The connection between the living and the dead had been severed, but it was a parting filled with peace, not sorrow. As the last of the embers cooled, Sarah sat by the now darkened campfire, the journal resting in her lap. The night was still and quiet, the lake reflecting the stars above. She felt a sense of serenity she hadn't known before, a feeling that the campers' souls had finally found the rest they had been seeking. The campfire would no longer burn, but the memory of those lost would live on in the stories she would tell, ensuring that they were never truly forgotten.